Microsoft 365 data is automatically backed up can feel a lot like this.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen,
Backing up Office 365 data with Veeam feels like this. So back it up with Veeam.
Thank you for joining us today. So quick introduction, we got the deep dish pizza approach to Microsoft Teams governance, deep, layered, and cheesy. I love the title. So Michael, feel free to take the screen. Yep, there you go. And let us know, give us a quick introduction about yourself and feel free to get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Thomas. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone, and super appreciate everyone being here. I know it's pretty late, but don't worry, we're going to get through this together. So yeah, so today's presentation is all around governance, around Microsoft Teams. Just like a Chicago pizza, we're going to go deep, we're going to get layered, and we're going to be cheesy. I don't actually think Chicago pizza is pizza at all, but that's a whole different story. I guess we can talk about that. So just a couple of things to begin. Please join the M365 Chicago, or please join M365 Chicago in supporting the Chicago Public Schools. If you want to make a donation, please go ahead and do that. The other thing as well is sponsors. Now, having run a product company or currently running a product company, sponsoring these events is super difficult because it's hard to get people to go and say hello and view these things. So just go and click on these people's solutions so they get kind of their money out of it as well. Like I said, just go and visit some of these sponsors. It's super nice that a lot of companies do sponsor these particular events. So make sure you go check them out. And finally, at the end of this, please make sure that you go and rank the speakers so we can become better. Like I said, we do this for you folks, so let us know about that. All right, so a little bit of an introduction. So my name is Michael Pisarek. I'm the CEO of a company called Orchestra Software. We are a new product that launched in August last year, based really for adoption and governance around Microsoft Teams. Previously to that, I had another company called Bonsai Intranet. So we were one of the first intranet in the box vendors. We got acquired in 2018, but we used to do a lot of large scale intranet work for a lot of organizations. And two of our customers with Bonsai over the 5 years won Nielsen Norman Intranet Awards. Since then, we got acquired, had a bit of a break. I had a baby, we got a dog, and then we started Orchestra. So I won't talk too much about it, but if you're interested in kind of some additional governance and adoption features around Microsoft 365, but particularly based around Teams, feel free to check it out. All right, bit of an agenda today. So first thing we're going to do is talk about some session goals. I want to make sure that people understand what we're going to go through and why we're here. The last thing you want to do is spend half an hour in a presentation and then kind of work out that this is nothing like what you're expecting. So we're going to talk about some goals. Then we're going to get onto the actual meat of the presentation. So the first thing we'll talk about is how strategy plays a role in governance. Then after that, we're going to talk about how governance can be actually implemented in Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams. So we're going to start at the high level. Then we're going to go down a little bit to talk about some of the governance features that Microsoft 365 provides. It's all out of the box. There's a lot of good stuff there. It's just a really confusing topic because everything was all over the place. So hopefully we can make that sensible for you folks today. And then the last kind of half of the presentation is we talk about kind of pragmatic governance examples. So what we're going to do, we're going to assume that we're three different types of organizations, one called Lockdown Corp, which wants to lock everything down, one called Balanced Industries, which is a little bit more balanced, and the last one called Startup Inc. And we're actually going to go through some particular scenarios and talk about how those types of organizations would implement governance. And the great thing about that is hopefully at the end of this session, maybe you see yourself in one of these organizations and you'll get something out of it so you can start implementing governance within your Microsoft 365 environment straight away. All right, so some session goals. First thing we're going to talk about is broadly what governance is and what it entails. I think governance is probably one of the most misunderstood terms in Microsoft 365. It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think really that's where everyone gets confused. So let's see if we can kind of nail down at least an understanding that you can take back to your organization in terms of what governance is. The next thing that we're going to do is provide or educate you on some of the options that Microsoft 365 provides. And there's a ton of them, and they're all over the place, and there is a lot you can do, but unfortunately a lot of organizations don't even begin this process of kind of tweaking some of these knobs to make sure that you can leverage some of these out-of-the-box capabilities. So let's go through them. Let's show you what they are. Then we'll talk about the scenarios between our three different companies. But really the goal of this presentation, it's not going to be a high-level esoteric philosophical discussion on governance. Let's actually do some stuff, let's implement some things, and let's see how this is all going to work. And hopefully at the end of this, you're going to have some kind of tangible examples that you can take back to your organization. All right, so let's get rocking and rolling here. Now, hopefully, like I said, it is pretty late. If you have drinks in your hands, that's fine. If you're like having, dinner, a pizza, that's fine. That's all good. So let's make this enjoyable for everyone. Right. First things first, let's talk about governance and strategy in teams of Microsoft 365. So where do you start with all of this? If you're undergoing, a governance implementation, where is the starting point? And really the starting point is outside of Microsoft 365. It's really more from a strategic level. The whole idea with governance should be to drive adoption, right? So your goal should be dynamic and frictionless service or self-service for users, but providing that balance of making sure that you're giving your users enough flexibility, but also making sure that your environment isn't compromised and you're ensuring any compliance rules and anything else there. In terms of what governance is typically that process of defining people, processes, and rules and structure, both within Microsoft Teams and around the broader Microsoft 365 ecosystems. And if you're looking at a typical governance plan, and we do have some examples of that, and we can send them over to you folks, typically you're looking at defining things like roles, so different roles and different use cases for responsibilities, things like IT, end users, Azure AD admins, team owners, team members. You also want to make sure that for each role, you define a set of responsibilities. So a team owner could be responsible, for instance, for requesting teams and making sure correct owners are applied, but maybe team members have got different types of permissions. The next thing that you also want to define is some processes, and I'll show you some examples of that in just a moment, but defining the processes, particularly from a team's perspective, in creation, deletion, archival, and basic management as well. The biggest one that we see challenges with at the moment is around Teams creation, because Microsoft 365 is so open, and by default, anyone can create anything. If you don't change those default settings within Microsoft 365, you can get into a lot of trouble really, really quickly. So we had a customer that we just spoke to. They launched Teams last year. They're a very large organization. They're, I think, 50,000 people. Within a year, they managed to create 18,500 teams, right? That's a lot of teams. That's like one team per every 3 people per year. That's a lot of teams. So like I said, now they're coming back and they're having real issues with duplication of content, with people being members of multiple teams, which are really the same thing, and they want to merge these teams together, but that's not necessarily easy also. But we'll talk about how to get around some of those things. Next thing is about access and ownership. So making sure, like I said, you understand who can do what. And finally, policies. So all the different policies that you have. The whole thing with governance, though, it should be a means to an end, right? Governance should help you achieve something. So there's a few things that you can basically help with, or governance can help from different perspectives. The first thing from that strategic level is around compliance, right? A lot of organizations have compliance rules that you need to follow, whether it's legal rules, whether it's social, whether it's cultural rules, or whether it's hard things like SOX. For instance, talking to a law firm this morning, part of their governance policy has to be to implement information barriers, because they don't want different people to be able to communicate with different people within the organization, because you can have conflicts within a law firm occur. The other thing, though, that I would really recommend you look from a governance perspective is kind of helping drive adoption, right? You can use governance rules not to hinder people, but to help people in their journey of Microsoft 365. And it's a great way to look at it. But one of the things that we see a lot of organizations do, and I really recommend, is that ability to use governance to kind of control the capabilities and the features that are enabled for end users. And once again, there's a lot of capabilities that you can use, but out of the box, pretty much everything is going to be lit up for end users. You can use some of these governance policies and settings within Teams to control some of these features and some of these capabilities, so you can roll it out in a bit more organized fashion. Of course, the other thing from governance at the moment, which is a huge challenge, is sprawl, right? Sprawl means lots of teams, lots of duplicated content, significant issues in findability, poor naming conventions. It all kind of falls into this bucket of what people are now calling sprawl. It used to happen within the old SharePoint days for self-service. It's happening more and more around Microsoft Teams. So having a process around creation in particular can help you manage that sprawl of content. And the other few things is obviously stopping information leaks, so making sure that you might have things like data loss prevention or retention policies, simplifying that end user experience. And then we have performance here, saying that performance will suffer with too many teams and sites. In Microsoft 365, that's not really a huge issue, or it's not really your issue, it's Microsoft issue. But think about performance from the ability that you want to make sure that users can find teams really quickly, channels are understood, there's a certain structure so people can use those as well. Really the big challenge with governance though is where do people fit? And there's no right answer, right? This is, I think, one of the things. There's no right answer for every organization, but there's probably a right answer for your organization when it comes to governance. And some organizations are very limited. So, using the out-of-the-box capabilities, users can share anything, they can create anything, guests are enabled. A lot of organizations start off on that route, but a lot of organizations also really want to tightly control the process. So very tightly controlled, where you can't create your own teams or groups. Maybe you want to also stop guests, and there needs to be a formal process around that. Even all the way down to meetings policies. Maybe we don't want to allow people to share their screen. We only want to allow people to share a PowerPoint presentation. And there's a whole layer of kind of options between the two. So like I said, most organizations, they tend to start off on that limited control way where everyone can create everything. I think the reason that happens is those are the out-of-the-box options. Then, depending on what happens with sprawl and duplication of content, they might try to tightly kind of lock everything down. And you don't want to go down that extreme approach. You want to find that balance. And hopefully some of the capabilities that we talk about is going to allow you to see that there is a lot of options. There's a lot of gray area here. So you're going to fit somewhere along this governance spectrum. If you ask me where most organizations fit, I would say that most organizations start off on the kind of the ad hoc self-service route. So the out-of-the-box options, people can go and create teams, but now they're starting to see if they can get a little bit more control over that. There's a number of tools that you can use. There's the Microsoft Request a Teams app. There's third-party tools, obviously, like what we provide, or there's some sort of manual process that organizations use, whether that's, like I said, a simple form that goes through Microsoft 365, or if you have a larger organization and you already have a process to request pieces, for instance, through something like ServiceNow, that's another process that you can use also. So the question is, why bother, right? Why go through all this stuff? Surely we can just deploy Teams, rip it out with the default options that Microsoft 365 provides, let people jam in all of their content, invite guests, and everything is going to be dandy. Fortunately, that's not usually the case. And the reason I think you want to go through this is just remember, out of the box in Microsoft 365, the majority of those features and settings are enabled. So the governance, if we go back a slide, where the out of the box approach is, if you don't change anything, and lots of organizations don't, it's in that limited control mechanism, right? People can create anything, they can add guests, they can share stuff. And I think the way that I try to think of it is, if you don't have any idea what you're trying to do, you're kind of overwhelming users. And the best way to think about this is, imagine if you were going to roll out an iPhone to people and you don't have an understanding of your use cases, you don't have an understanding of your user requirements or some of those strategic elements. So what you're doing is basically saying, well, we don't know what people are going to do. So we're going to give them an iPhone, but let's just download every single app from the App Store because surely people are going to work it out themselves, right? That's essentially what you're doing if you don't make any of these changes. The great thing, though, is there's a ton of simple configuration that we're going to go through that you can actually use, right? You don't need PowerShell. You don't need code. These things are really simple to change and add and move later on as well. And the nice thing is because it's just basic configuration, you can give it a go. If it doesn't work, you can just change the configuration back as well. So there's a lot of flexibility there. All right. Now that we kind of understand from the strategic perspective what we need, so we need to understand our users, we need to understand some of those inputs that we have. How is governance actually implemented in teams? So let's say we have our processes defined, we have our roles defined, we understand all of that as the business perspective. How do we operationalize this, right? How do we actually make this happen within Microsoft 365 using the tools and capabilities that we provide? So luckily for all of us, Microsoft has provided a ton of governance capabilities. Unfortunately, they're a little bit all over the place, right? And that's part of, or that's a byproduct of the way that Teams is structured also, that it's based around something called a Microsoft group. So unfortunately, there's no governance center in Microsoft 365. There's a few different admin centers you have to look at, whether it's the Teams admin center, whether it's Azure AD for some of the other capabilities like exploration and naming policies, or whether it's the security and compliance area for things like data loss prevention and retention. There's a few different areas that we are going to have a look at, but that's okay. We're going to go through all of that. In terms of the way this is set up, it's set up in a very, very smart way. So you can have things called, you can have global settings, for instance. So a setting typically is applied to a global audience. But then you can also have policies which can be assigned to individual users or individual groups of users as well. So like I said, you've got a lot of flexibility in terms of saying we're not going to let anyone create teams versus we are going to let everyone create teams. You can get a little bit more granular than that. So you can say, well, by default, no one's going to be allowed to create teams unless maybe they've gone through a 15-minute Teams kind of training video, and then we're going to put them into an Active Directory group, which has the ability to create teams. So there's lots of flexibility there. There is also a ton of governance controls within Teams as well. So there is a lot of stuff that you can use. Just in Teams, just in the Teams Admin Center, there's a lot of goodness there as well. So things like policies around applications. You can control the types of apps that users can see and add from Microsoft Teams, as well as maybe you also want to pin particular apps to users based on role within Teams as well. So by default, like I said, if you roll out Microsoft Teams, if someone clicks on add an app, they get all of the Microsoft apps. They also get all of the gazillion third-party apps that they have. So like I said, a user can go and add any type of app from anywhere if it's within the Microsoft Teams store. Maybe you don't want to do that, or maybe you don't want to confuse users by seeing 57 versions of some kind of crazy app there. If you think about it from an adoption perspective, maybe you want to limit the apps that are available and just target the apps which are going to be useful for your organization. So we can do that as well. There's a whole range of settings and policies around meetings as well. What guests can do, what users can share. If transcription is available, can guests bypass the lobby? All of those pieces as well. Really common things around naming as well. You can also apply naming policies to make sure that your teams and your groups are automatically going to be named correctly. Whole things around channel settings, guest access, external access, messaging policies, all of the good stuff. So there's a lot of stuff there. But where do you start? So what are the kind of the 6 or 7 things that most organizations start with from a governance perspective? And once again, this is what we commonly find, or this is where some of those governance decisions you might want to make typically start with. So the first one is who can create, right? That's probably the biggest decision point for a lot of organizations. That process around creation and requesting of teams, Once again, that's probably the first thing we're going to look at this as well, is who can create teams, SharePoint sites, and groups, right? So some decisions around who can create SharePoint sites, who can create teams, who can create OneDrives, and who can create groups, for instance. That's one of the first decisions that people really start to do from a governance perspective. The next one is around naming conventions. So making sure that your teams are named correctly is really, really important. From an end user perspective, a correctly named team is going to help them understand what that team is for. And the second thing is from a search perspective. Having correctly named teams is going to help users search for teams that they have access to. And if you've ever tried to use the team search, let's be honest, it's pretty crap. So if your naming policies aren't there and you're using Teams search to search for additional teams, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So making sure you have correct naming conventions is really important. Luckily, once again, there's some capabilities within Microsoft 365 for prefixes, suffixes, and naming policies as well. The next one is around guest access. So once again, the ability to add external users or guests to your teams is something that's really, really important. Now, unfortunately, out of the box, it's either a yes or no option. So either you allow guests into all teams or you disallow them. If you want to get a little bit more granular, for instance, you want to allow some teams to have guests and other teams to not, you can do that, but there needs to be an additional process. Maybe it's a PowerShell command, maybe it's a third-party tool, or maybe it's something that's done manually. The other thing that we also find from a guest access perspective is in some cases you want maybe users or maybe guests to have access to the team, but not the underlying SharePoint site, or conversely, you want your guests to just have access to the documents that are created as part of that team, but not the actual team itself. And you can actually do that as well through configuring external sharing options for SharePoint also. So that's another typical governance thing. The fourth one is around expiry. This is something that we're seeing a lot of happening with organizations that have gone onto Microsoft 365. They've deployed teams maybe during COVID. They've created all of these teams. There wasn't really much time to do or have any governance in place. And now they've come back, a year and a half, and they have far too many teams, and they have no idea if these teams have been used or not. And this happens pretty often, right? So a lot of times, especially when people are new to Teams, if it's self-service, people are just interested, they'll go in. Someone like me is a classic example. I'll go in, I see, ooh, this is new. I'll create a team. I'll call it a Michael's Lunch Test. I'll use that team for a day, and then I leave it. And it's there in perpetuity to die. So understanding expiry and having some of those governance rules applied can also be really valuable. Once again, there's capabilities within Microsoft 365 to do that. Then you get a little bit more, granular and technical. So one of the other ones, just to jump down, is the use of templates. So now Microsoft 365 has the concept of Teams templates. Also, SharePoint site templates are coming out fairly soon. I'm a huge fan of Teams templates in particular. I think it can be a really great way to help users adopt Teams and also help control the structure across teams. So in terms of Teams templates, really easy to set up. And the whole idea is, instead of your end users going in and requesting a blank team and having to create their own channels and their own tabs and going through all of that, you can actually have a Teams template based on a particular business scenario. It could be a project, it could be a department team, it could be an RFP response, it could be a committee. There's a lot of common things that people do, and the idea is they can go request that team, and at least they have some pieces built out for them also. And then policies as well. So when you start getting a little bit more advanced, looking at things like retention, e-discovery, and data loss prevention. Once again, all of these items are available. And then the last thing from a governance perspective is also monitoring, right? So making sure that you understand where things are. Once again, there is Teams reporting, but because Teams is so, it's almost like a Medusa. There's kind of got tentacles everywhere. Because you have to look at a few different places. You have to look at some things from the Teams Admin Center, some things from the SharePoint Admin Center, some things from Office 365. And if you want really good aggregated reporting, once again, you can use those tools, or alternatively, Microsoft provides some capabilities in the Office 365 adoption pack also. But these are some of the first things you want to start off with. You don't have to do all of them. Some of these are huge endeavors, particularly looking at things like retention and DLP and e-discovery. But probably the first things that I would recommend you start with are the top 4. Who can create teams, naming conventions, guest access, and expiry as well. So now that we kind of understand some of the capabilities available, let's go through and see how some of these things can actually be implemented. All right, so what we're going to do this in a little bit different way. We're going to call this pragmatic governance. And the way we're going to do this is we are going to pretend we're 3 different organizations and seeing how we can kind of tweak these knobs here to meet these organizational objectives here. So the first one that we have is Lockdown Corp. Lockdown Corp works in a heavily regulated industry dealing with PII and health data. They need to be controlled in their environment. Lockdown Corp, it's one of these organizations. It's probably not the most fun place to work, let's be honest, but they need everything locked down. So any type of governance decision that we make, they're going to lean to very heavily restricted settings, right? So Lockdown Corp, whatever decisions we make is going to be super, super restrictive. Balanced Industries wants to strike a balance. So Balanced Industries wants to strike a balance between IT control and end user adoption. So Balanced Industries is going to consider the balance between IT and user sides and make some of those governance decisions accordingly. And then the last one is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. is one of these rapidly growing startups. They've got like $50 billion in funding. They have an office. That office probably has beanbags. They probably have a barista on every single floor, right? All of the good stuff that everyone wants. But Startup Inc. is growing so rapidly, they don't really need to, or they don't want to stop any type of collaboration. So they want to empower their users and drive productivity with as little friction as possible. So Startup Inc. is going to lean to very open settings. Now, a point of context that I always make during this stage. You might be working for Lockdown Corp, but if you've rolled out Teams and you haven't changed any of the default governance settings, you are functioning essentially as Startup Inc., right? The default settings that Microsoft provides is much more Startup Inc., very open, than Lockdown Corp, which is very, very closed. I know that might shock a lot of you, but that's the truth. And the reason for that is Microsoft's whole philosophy is making sure to empower people with as little kind of friction as possible. So it's an important point to make. You might be working in a super highly regulated organization. You might have deployed Teams or Microsoft 365. If you haven't changed any of these settings, essentially you are Startup Inc. So don't be shocked. It's just the way that it is. And lots of organizations that we work with, like I said, they think that there's all this protection, but there really isn't unless you go and configure some of these pieces. All right, let's talk about the first one. First point is Teams creation. So the decision point here is, once again, decision point is who's going to be able to create teams and groups within your organization. By default, this is very open, but really limiting teams creation can kind of help in controlling sprawl and enforcing structure, but also there's a cost associated with that, because if users can't just go in and create teams, what's going to happen is someone has to do that, or there has to be some form of process. That process can be done or can be automated through Power Apps or through other third-party tools. That process could be something that's manual. We see a lot of organizations where they just do this in a manual sort of format, where it's like a human being doing it, or that process can either run through another tool completely. So like I said, if you're a larger organization and you're using something like ServiceNow to request things, maybe that goes through that or so. Now you can control this as well. Once again, controlling creation of teams or limiting this is fairly easy to do. You need to do a little bit of PowerShell for this, as well as some Microsoft configuration options. To be honest with you, I think Microsoft tries to make this a little bit more difficult than it should be, but it is pretty easy to do. But there's also some nuance there. So once again, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing approach. So how would this apply to our 3 different organizations? All right, so if we're Lockdown Corp, surprise, surprise, Lockdown Corp is going to disable the creation of teams, right? So they're going to disable the creation of teams and the native UI, and they're going to use a tool to control the request. That could be a Power App that people have to go through to request a team. The Microsoft Request a Teams app is really awesome for that. Or maybe if they're a little bit bigger, they're going through a third-party or something like ServiceNow or Salesforce or through a help desk or whatever that process is. If Lockdown Corp does do that, if you disable group creation, that button on Teams still appears, which is kind of a little bit annoying from an end user perspective. But what you'll find is even though it says create team, the only option you get is this add to existing group option, right? It's a really subtle UX thing. I don't think they do a good job of it. It does tend to kind of confuse people, but it still says create team, but they can only create a team of an existing group, right? So once again, it can be a little bit confusing. The point is they can't go in and create a new team and a new group. Balanced Industries does something a little bit different and something that we're finding a lot of organizations doing. And I really like this approach. So Balanced Industries is going to allow people to create teams, but only some of them. And what they're going to say is, listen, we know that creating a team or requesting a team can be a bit of a process. So what we're going to do, by default, we're going to shut this off. If you want to be able to request teams, maybe you have to go through a 5-minute video or 15-minute video, talk about some governance policies, what teams are, at least give people an understanding of what it is. Then we can put them into an Active Directory group, and that AD group has the ability to create teams, and then they can go and create teams through the native UI. So you can see there's a bit of a balance there. I really like this approach. I think it's a nice balanced way to be able to control creation and governance. It can work really well. And then Startup Inc., once again, they're happy having users create as many teams as they can. And as far as they're concerned, let people create the teams. If there's any issues, we'll deal with it later. So Startup Inc. is going to go, once again, down that default route, and they're going to let anyone go and create teams through here. And like I said, and you'll hear me saying before, if you haven't changed any of the settings, you might be Lockdown Corp, but you're functioning as Startup Inc. Next thing that we commonly find is around default and available applications. So the couple of decision points around this is what apps do we want to give our users access to? And is there any applications that we want to default for our users? Now, the default apps thing we found historically hasn't been used too much. Now it is being used a lot because of Microsoft Viva, right? Or Viva Connections. So that Viva Connections app allows you to bring your intranet into Teams. And what a lot of organizations want to do is they want to pin that Viva Connections app directly in the Teams rail for users. So there's a couple of things there. Now, the decision points is a couple of things that you want to do. In terms of what apps do we want to give our users access to, by default, if you haven't configured this, any user can go and add any third-party app from the Teams App Store. And by the last count, it's getting close to 1,000, right? So there's a lot of apps there. There's a lot of apps which people can go and start using. This can be incredibly annoying for IT because now they're supporting some random app that someone basically added to Teams. It can also be incredibly confusing for end users because there's all these things. Maybe they don't know what to use and they want to have a task management tool and they don't understand that they have Planner. So they go and just add an app. They don't actually know it's something outside of Teams because it's all integrated nicely together. And they start using some third-party task management tools. So you might want to control the third-party apps that are available also. Once again, you might want to ensure that users don't add any third-party apps or don't add any custom apps as well. So within Teams, there's kind of 2 different types or 3 different types of apps that are defined through this policy. They're Microsoft apps, which are applications published through the partners. Typically, you want to give people the ability to do those. There's what are called third-party apps. Third-party apps are apps that appear in the App Store. And there's custom apps. Custom apps are essentially custom applications that your organization has built and you've uploaded and you've made available to users. So once again, what we want to do is understand what apps do we want to give our users access to and what apps do we want to default for our users. And you can easily do this. However, there's a few things you have to tweak. So there's 3 different types of, or there's 1 setting and 2 policies. An org-wide application setting, a setup policy, and an application permission policy. All of them are located in the Teams Admin Center. Right, so let's talk about Lockdown Corp. Lockdown Corp, they want to remove access to any third-party apps. They also don't want to allow any users to add any personal apps, nor to let them pin apps. So basically what Lockdown Corp wants to do is say, we're only using team. You're not adding any of your own custom apps. We're not going to allow you to have access to any of the third-party apps because we don't know what kind of craziness you might do. And we're also not going to allow you to pin apps as well. So they really want to control that experience for users. The way that they would configure that within the Teams Admin Center is in the org-wide settings. They're going to disallow third-party apps. They're going to disallow any new third-party apps published from the App Store, and they're also going to disallow custom apps as well. Hang on, let me get the old laser pointer here. There we go. So they're going to disallow these things here. They're also going to apply an application, what's called an application permission policy. So they're blocking all of the Microsoft apps, they're blocking all of the third-party apps, and they're blocking all of the custom apps. So essentially, if I'm a user, if I click on apps, I'm not going to see any third-party apps. I'm not going to see any custom apps in Lockdown Corp as well. And the final thing that they're doing is they're not going to allow users to upload custom apps or to allow pinning. And essentially, the only thing users will ever see is what appears here in this pinned apps area, right? So very, very tightly controlled. Probably not the best approach, to be honest with you, but really, really tightly controlled. So that is an option there. Balanced Industries is a little bit more balanced. So Balanced Industry says we're going to allow users to add some third-party apps, but not all of them, right? Because we don't know what's there. We want to kind of control that experience for people. They also have another solution which they want to pin automatically, or maybe they want to pin Microsoft Viva connections there for people as well. So it's a bit more of a balanced approach. So what they do is they're going to allow third-party apps. But what they're going to do is they're going to allow third-party apps from a point in time, but any new apps that are published to the App Store by default, they're not going to allow. This is an interesting option because what happens is by default, if you allow third-party apps and you have this option available as well, it means any apps that get published from now to infinity, users are going to be able to add. They want a little bit more control, so they've reviewed the third-party apps that exist at the moment. They're going to stop. They're going to allow those, but they're also going to stop any new ones so they can kind of review them through here. They're going to allow custom apps, and the reason they're going to allow custom apps is if you want to deploy Viva connections, that's a custom app, so you have to make sure that you have that checked. From the permission policy, they're good with all of the Microsoft apps. For the third-party ones, they're using an option that are going to allow specific apps and block all the others. So the apps that they're going to allow is the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow for Teams, right? So stuff that they know people use, there's training around. If I click on add, I'll see the Microsoft ones, and I'll also see these third-party apps. And finally, they're going to allow a custom app. In this case, it's Orchestry. Most likely, it's going to be something like Viva Connections, however, and once again, we can make that happen. And what they've also done is they have an app setup policy. So they want to make sure that whenever someone logs into Teams, they have these apps pinned to them, so users don't have to go and do that manually. So they're allowing custom pinning, and they're also pinning Orchestry or Viva connections there as well. So this is a nice approach. Once again, you're limiting some ability, you're giving some things to users, and the app setup policy is extremely useful that you can pin these apps to people. And remember, you can have some nuance there. So because this is done per Active Directory group, maybe for the marketing folks, you automatically pin them, let's say the Adobe Creative Cloud, but maybe for the IT folks, you automatically pin, let's say, Jira and Stack Overflow to Teams as well. So once again, a lot of different options there. Finally, Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., they're good. They want anyone to have anything available. So they're not going to change anything. And by default, like I said, default, remember, if you don't touch anything, you're functioning as Startup Inc. They're going to allow any apps, both now and in the future. They're going to allow custom apps. Users can add any Microsoft apps, any third-party apps, any custom apps, and they can also pin whatever items that they want or upload their own custom apps through here also as well. So once again, Startup Inc. uses those default options. Very, very open through here as well. Right, let's move on to the next thing. Teams naming policies, really common thing. So what you want to do is you want to enforce naming conventions on how teams and groups are named. Now, if you think that people name teams and groups correctly, I'm sure you've seen some horror stories. If you've ever seen how people name stuff on file shares, they're probably worse naming teams and SharePoint sites. So it's pretty bad, and it's usually useful to have some form of policy. Now, I always ask this during these presentations of the best team or the best team or group name anyone has ever found. The best team name that I have ever seen as a customer was someone created a team called Do Not Invite John Here. That was the name of the team, right? Because they had no naming conventions there. I don't know who John was. Obviously, he wasn't supposed to be invited to that team. But once again, it's an example. If you have no naming conventions, you start to get into some pretty interesting and funky naming pieces. We also have one customer where basically what would happen is every time they had a meeting, which was once a week, someone would create a completely new team for that and call it meeting and the date because they didn't know how to use Teams also. And they were all doing it. And in the end, they had like 3,500 teams, which were all called the date and the meeting, which was really odd. But once again, there was no real training provided to them. So what I'm trying to say is having naming policies in place can be incredibly useful. The reason, like I said, how you name teams is going to have a huge impact on findability and usage. Now, you can do this either manually, or there's also some capabilities within Microsoft 365 as part of Azure AD. It's part of the P1 license though, so it's a premium license, so it might be additional costs. But what you can do, you can control the naming, the prefixes and the suffixes. The other thing it's also going to allow you to do is have certain blocked words. So there might be particular words you don't want people to use in team names. Acronyms is a good example. One of the other ones we see really common is you don't want people to put in security things within team names, so private or public, because once again that might change. Also, obviously some other blocked words, things like swear words or inappropriate things can also be common as well. But once again, you can configure this out of the box. In terms of what some naming policies could look like, because this is something that we get asked a lot. Just some typical examples. For projects, having a project prefix like PRJ or PROJ is really, really common. Dash the project ID, and then dash maybe the descriptive name is a really common one. For departments, the same sort of thing, having DEPT in front of a team so people know what it is. If you've got some organizations, we also find it's really common that if you've got guests or external users, they'll actually put that within the team so people understand there's guests within those teams. So something like EXT as a prefix or guests. If you've got multinational, so if you're a big multinational organization, a lot of them have like the geography and then the business unit and then the descriptive name. And then if you're a school, and we took this directly from Harvard, having like the organization or the school prefix, the department, and the descriptive name can be really useful. And the reason this is going to be useful, it's kind of subtle, right? So here on the, let's get the laser pointer here. Here on the left-hand side, we've got a bunch of teams. These teams are pretty well named. They're not too bad, but just applying some naming conventions just applies a whole bunch of context to this, right? So I can easily see what are projects. I can easily see what are departments, right? I can see this HR, this Contoso, I can see it belongs to the USA, the HR department, and the name is Contoso here. But once again, this provides a whole bunch of context to people when they're looking at teams, both for end users, but also for admins, right? Because if you're in the team's admin center or the group's admin center, and you just have a team called Contoso, you have no idea if that's a department team, if it has guest users, if it's a project, whatever that is. So having or applying that initial additional context can be super useful. All right, a couple more here. The other one is around team owners, members and settings. So another big one. So once again, the decision point around this is what are we going to allow team members in particular to do? With owners, you don't actually have that much flexibility, right? If you're an owner of the team, you can easily do this, but you might want to control what members can do. So some of the decision points around members in particular is how much power do you want your team members to have in Teams? Especially for members, do you want them allowed to do things like manage channels, add or remove tabs, or edit their messages? Particularly if people are new to Teams, if members can do anything, you can get into some pretty kind of horrible situations. A lot of our customers, the default is members can do anything. Members will go in, and a classic example would be a member will go in and think that they're hiding the wiki tab, but they're actually deleting it. And if there's content in that wiki, that content disappears into the ether, never to return. So that's a really common thing. Or maybe members inviting people, or maybe members, removing tabs. You've got a lot of flexibility that you can basically do there as well. So once again, you've got a lot of control, right, in terms of defining what your members in particular teams can do. So what would Lockdown Corp do? So Lockdown Corp, essentially, they want to control what members do in teams. So they basically disable everything, right? So Lockdown Corp is doing the typical thing that Lockdown Corp does. They're going to disable all of the member settings. So basically, members can't create channels. They can't restore them. They can't add apps. They can't move tabs. They can't do connectors, all of that sort of stuff also. So basically, as a member, you're going in. The only thing you're going to be able to do is go and add particular items, right? So I can add documents and I can have conversations, but I can't do anything else here. I'll get to your question in just 1 second, Greg. I'll just finish this, mate. The next thing is balanced industries. So balanced industries is an interesting option. And once again, I like this because it's a nice balance of kind of empowering the members, but making sure they don't have too much power so they don't do anything crazy. So balanced industries allows anyone to become a team member without any training, but they want the site owners to control the structure of the content. So they don't allow members to do things like create channels or configure apps. They do allow members to maybe add tabs and add connectors, but members can't go and create their own channels. A big challenge we're finding with organizations around channels is a lot of the times people create teams, they have no idea that the concept of another channel exists. So the only channel that they have is the general channel, and that general channel is pounded with conversations or posts, which doesn't make any sense. That's the first thing. The other thing, though, is that if people go and create channels, maybe they're not using the correct naming conventions, or they create channels which names don't make sense, or a really common one is they create channels and they think they can move the order of channels which are seen, but they're not, right? The channels, you've got no way to control the order unless you use an alphanumeric numbering system, which we'll get to that question in just a moment. But once again, this balanced industries approach is pretty neat. Essentially, the owners control the structure, so the teams and the channels, but you're allowing your members to do things like add tabs or add connectors without giving them the ability to delete these channels, for instance. And then Startup Inc., by the way, so Startup Inc. Essentially allows people to do anything. This is the default option. So once again, from a default perspective, if you are allowing your users or you're not changing anything, this is essentially what's going to happen. So by default, members can go and add channels and all of that sort of stuff. That could be a problem, right? We've been in a lot of situations where a member will go in, maybe they accidentally delete a channel, all of those posts are then gone. It's pretty tricky to get that stuff back. Luckily, the documents don't get deleted, all of that stuff gets kept, but it can be a little bit problematic. All right, so we have a question, Greg. Awesome. How long can and should teams names be? I think it's about 256 characters, which is pretty long. How long should they be is probably the better question. One of the reasons of keeping them pretty short, let's go to something that looks like teams here. Hang on, there we go, people. So one of the reasons for keeping them fairly short is if they're longer than this, right, what's going to happen is it starts to get truncated, right, a little bit. It's also one of the reasons that you probably want that prefix information at the start of those teams, because if you have it at the end, people actually have to hover over it, right, which becomes a bit of a hassle. I don't have I don't have like a number for you, but I would say, like here we've got some teams created with some nice kind of naming conventions through here. Once they start to get pretty long like this, what's going to happen is they start to truncate within the team's client, which gets a little bit problematic. Your next question around should team names have no spaces? It doesn't really matter, to be honest with you. I think in a lot of cases people do. If they have prefixes, they kind of tag the prefixes to here. I actually think it looks a little bit better if you don't have spaces and you have dashes through there. It doesn't really make much difference from a search perspective, unfortunately, because the search thing for teams isn't very good. Like when you go in to Teams here and you want to join and create a team, unfortunately, I've got all of them through here, but this actually doesn't work. Like it doesn't do good searching, right? Through here. So I'll give you a good example of this. So let's say we have a team right here called Mark8 project team. And let's say, oh, I want to see everything that could be a project. I search for proj, I don't get anything, right? This is not a great experience for team search. Once again, in this case, it doesn't even find me that as well. So once you can see, I'm not a huge fan of this team search experience. I'm sure it's going to get better. If I do a search for Mark, I will find it, right? So it's not particularly great. It's also a huge challenge for a lot of organizations. With channel naming, though, I am a little bit more strict around channel names. I've got an article I'll share with you folks. But once again, I think there's a whole range of things around channel namings. You want to make sure, like in information architecture, that all of your channel names make sense. You also want to make sure that your channel names mutually exclusive. So you wouldn't have a channel called quality assurance and a channel called testing within the same team, because it could be a little bit confusing also. The other thing what a lot of organizations do is the controlling of the order of these, right? By default, this is alphabeticized or alphanumeric. A lot of organizations want to control that, and they put like 1 dash, 2 dash, whatever that is. That also can be a hassle, because if you add it, you have to call the next one 1, 1, right? So it gets a little bit crazy. The other thing is a lot of people use emojis in these team names. I don't mind the use of emojis. I just think people go emoji crazy. You know what I mean? And there's like 27 emojis with like rocket ships and whatever else. I don't think that adding a rocket ship to your team or your channel name is actually going to do that much for you. Is there a way to set a policy about renaming teams? No, there isn't. No, it has to be done manually or some sort of automated process. Is there a policy hook for channel names? There isn't, mate. No, not unless you use a third-party tool, right? Something like Orchestrate or some sort of Power Apps. But no, there's not. There's no, from what I'm aware, I don't think there's a policy hook or even a Power Automate hook around channel creation. There might be around Power Automate, but it's not something that you're going to be able to do out of the box here. And just let me know if that answered questions. All right, we've only got a few more minutes here, so let's go and add. Let's look at one more thing. Teams messaging settings. All right, really quickly. The other decision point around this is around Teams messaging settings, right? So this is an interesting one because this is outside of Teams. This is more about conversations. But the decision point here is like what types of actions users can perform using chat and channel messaging within Teams. This is really rare that I actually see people change this, but I think it's really useful. There's some things that you can control in terms of what people do when they type those messages through there. So once again, you can use this in a couple of different ways. If you want to be a real stickler, you can remove some of the fun elements like removing stickers or GIFs. God only knows why would you want to do that, because let's be honest, probably the most fun you have in Teams is using GIFs during chat, but you can remove that if you want to. The other thing you can also do, and this is one of the examples, there's lots more, you can kind of control the rollout of features. So one of them is like read receipts or priority notifications. You can actually disable the use of people using priority notifications, maybe get your organization trained, and then enable that feature also. So you've got some capabilities through there. The other nice thing around this is a good example of using these Teams policies to almost simplify that interface, right? You can see at the top here, this is the default out-of-the-box Teams chat. Like there's lots of things here, and this is one that you can basically add these as well through here as well. All right, messaging settings. Let's talk about Lockdown Corp. So Lockdown Corp wants to stay very professional. Since in Lockdown Corp every single thing is a record. They don't even allow the users to delete or edit messages. They turn off read receipts, and they even turn off message translation because of legal reasons. So once again, Lockdown Corp has a policy. Users can't delete messages, they can't edit them, they can't send them. Read receipts is disabled. They do have chat enabled, so at least they have that. You can actually disable chat within Teams. It's something that a lot of people don't know about. It's not going to be conversations within a team. It'll be actually the chat capabilities. They disallow GIFs and Giphy and memes and stickers, all of the fun stuff that everyone loves. Hey, it's Lockdown Corp, and I'm not going to do any of that stuff. And they're also dislabeling, translation, and a bunch of other stuff here as well, right? So once again, you can remove all of this stuff really, really easily if you want to. Industries is an interesting one. So Balance Industries is going to be using Slack. So they're going to turn off the chat functionality for some users. The other thing that you can also have is they haven't communicated how to use read receipts or urgent functionality. So they're going to turn that off for now. And then once they do some training, then they're going to enable that feature. So hopefully this gives you an idea. You can use some of these policies to control the flow of some of these capabilities through here. And then the last thing is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., like I said, they really don't care. So they're going to allow any user to do anything. So once again, these are these default options, right? So users can go and edit and delete messages. They've got read receipts, chats available, Giphies are available. All of that good stuff is available through here. So once again, there's all of that good stuff that's available as well. So like I said, lots of capabilities and lots of options. Now we've gone through maybe 1/100th of some of these options, but hopefully you understand just how much flexibility you have, and everything that you essentially have here. This is all out of the box stuff, right? There's only one thing you need. You need PowerShell. These are all capabilities available in the Teams Admin Center, the SharePoint Admin Center, and in the other ways. All right, if you're still here with me, this is amazing. And like I said, I'm super appreciative. I know it's probably pretty late wherever you are. I'm in Vancouver, so I'm on the West Coast, so it's only like 4 p.m. here. But I appreciate it. Some takeaways before I let all of you go into the weekend. Once again, think of governance in terms of empowering your organization, right? It's up to you. We want to make sure that you're providing capabilities to your end users, but you've got all of these pieces to be able to go and also control these items as well. Teams has a ton of governance options, right? Like I said, if you think that you're running as Lockdown Corp, but you haven't changed anything, you are Startup Inc. That can be shocking to a lot of organizations. But like I said, Microsoft leans, those default options are very, very, very open. So maybe go back to your organization, see what you have there, maybe tweak some of these items also. And then the last thing, like I said, you probably don't want to roll out teams with not undergoing a little bit of planning. You can always start small. I know governance can be a really, really big topic, but at least start off with those main capabilities that we talk about. Controlling provisioning, getting some naming conventions in place, thinking about guest user access, and also doing a little bit around exploration also. All right, I'm going to stop. Everyone, hopefully that session was informative to you all. Like I said, I super appreciate the time. I know it's a little bit late wherever you are. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thomas, why don't I hand it back over to you as well, mate?
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to the audience here. Looks like there was a couple more like follow-up questions. I'm not sure if you got to all of them.
Oh yeah, Greg, governance guide. Yeah, Greg, I'll just send me your details or just contact me on Twitter. Greg, I think we've met before. Anyway, I've got a couple of blog articles around that, particularly around naming for tabs and channels, which might be useful for you. And you talk about MS, about app icons on tabs. Yeah, good one. No, there isn't. I haven't seen anything about allowing emojis or icons on tabs quite yet. And I do agree with you. I think the tabs, the naming's weird because it truncates really, really quickly as well, right? So it can be a little bit problematic. I haven't seen anything around that. But there is a new version of Teams client in the works. So who knows what's going to happen with that as well. Hopefully, it's a client which is not going to use 100% of your CPU. That's my hope for that, but we'll see how it goes.
Or suck up all your memory.
Exactly.
All right, well, I think that's it for today. There's no more sessions. Let's see, is there a wrap up? Let's just check that out. No, I don't see a wrap up on here. But thanks everybody for joining, and that's it for now. All right, have a great weekend. Have a great night.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me, mate. Appreciate it.